טובים.
Good afternoon.
שומעים?
Can you hear? Can you hear me?
זה לא הכנסת, שקט.
This isn't the Knesset. Quiet, please.
צהריים טובים.
Good afternoon.
שמי דוד גולינקין.
My name is David Golinkin. I teach Talmud, Halakha, and Midrash here at the Schechter Institute, and I'm one of the organizers of today's conference. I'll be adding a few remarks between the sessions. We want to express our solidarity with the residents of the Gaza Strip region and pray for peace. I'd like to begin with a passage from Masechet Brachot. Rav Chia bar Rabin was told, these tefillin of the Kadosh Baruch Hu, what does it say in them? Am Yisrael is one people. When we put on tefillin every day and it says Hashem Eloheinu Hashem Echad, we learn that Hashem puts tefillin on every day and it says Mi kamcha Yisrael goy echad ba'aretz. Your people are a solitary nation among the nations. Another source is also very well known in Midrash Tanchuma Buber edition, Parshat Nitzavim. Usually a person can pick up a clump of sticks and break them, but a person cannot break the sticks if they are all together. This means if you take, let's say, a pencil or a stick like this, and you try to break it, you can break it. But if you take 12 pencils and put them together in a bundle, only Hercules or Og Melech HaBashan can break these. In another source, a medieval source, Abravanel writes in his commentary on Judges, he says, the special essence of the people of Israel is to be apart from the nations and be unified. All these sources together say that the people of Israel, the Jewish people, must find unity amongst themselves and praise the value of the unity of the Jewish people. In recent years, we've witnessed a separation, a distancing between the state of Israel and Jews in North America. Some people call this a conflict, others call this a rupture between some of the Jews in Israel and some of the Jews in North America. This is a very problematic and even dangerous situation for the Jewish people. That's why we had our first annual conference last year on the state of Israel and the Jews of North America, co-sponsored by the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Schechter Institute in Jerusalem. The idea was put forth by Professor Arnold Eisen, who is here, and over 200 people came last year to participate in the conference. This year, too, about 200 people registered. Some of them will be here in the auditorium, and some will be listening and watching downstairs in our Bet Midrash. This goes to show how important, how urgent this issue is to so many people. Last year we had a video transmission. We have journalists writing about this and interviewing us. Last year we focused on bridging the gap through education, and we devoted a session to halachic issues such as conversion and the Kotel. This year we'll be focusing on being a Jew in Israel and in the United States, commonalities and differences. We'll begin with greetings by Professor Arnold Eisen, the 7th Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in America. He took up this office in 2007. He's an expert on Jewish thought in the modern period, has published numerous articles and books on these issues, and we are honored to have Professor Eisen coming from the US to take part in this conference. Professor Eisen. Shalom, I'd like to start with 3 introductory remarks. Ari Ackerman, Doran Bar, and the Schechter staff, I would like to thank you for organizing this second annual conference, and I thank you all for participating. As David just said, this is not just an important issue, it is critical, it's crucial for our future, for our very future as a people, as a nation. We want to impact the world, we want to gain in power, and as a matter of fact, we see a crisis developing. How can we bridge the gaps? If we can't do it, who can? If we don't do it now, when? Schechter, the JTS, the conservative movement in the US, the Masorti movement in Israel, we are the spearhead. If we can't do this, who can? It's on us. We have to take it upon ourselves to do the best we can and bridge the gaps. I have here the concluding passage of a lecture that Gershom Shalom gave exactly 50 years ago. He delivered a lecture, I think it was in the US, on the relations between Jews in Israel and in the diaspora. And he concluded, we have a Hebrew version, but I will give you the English version. This is something extremely important, and it motivates me, myself, in my work, and this is why I came here to this conference. This is why I devote so much of my time to bridging the gap between Jews in Israel and Jews in the diaspora.
As I conclude these observations, I should like to say one thing.
So they should get it
It
through
is
the,
a personal
maybe I'll say that.
factor
Okay. The speaker is quoting a passage in English.
in this mutual concern that will be decisive when all is said and done. Let us not deceive ourselves. No matter how useful and stimulating may be the pilgrimages, the visits, the educational activities, for the preservation and development of what we have in common, and whatever else will come to our minds, they will not be the decisive factor for our relationship. Decisive will be the personal and most intimate factor. What matters is whether we are involved personally, whether we discover a direct connection between transcending everything institutional, which is to say, whether we discover the unity in our differences.
The speaker is quoting a passage in English.
Of feeling and hope cannot yet be formulated in adequate concepts.
When I see the JTS students and the Schechter students sitting, talking together, developing this dialogue in depth, going into profound issues, discussing the differences and the common elements in their lives, I see how important it is. Thank you for coming.
עכשיו יש לי הכבוד להציג את פרופסור
I
דורון
have the pleasure and honor to call upon Professor Doron Bar, the president of the Schechter Institute, a world-renowned expert on geography of Eretz Israel, has published dozens of articles and books on the subject, and he entered office about 4 years ago. Over the past year, registration to the Institute has grown. We have many new programs. Professor Bar. Thank you, Professor David Golinkin, and thanks too to Professor Arnold Eisen, the Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary in America. I thank Professor Eisen for coming to Israel, especially for our conference. I also thank him for the warm bond between the two institutes, the JTS and the Schechter Institute. This afternoon, we mark the cooperation and love between the Jews of North America and the State of Israel, and the connection between JTS and the Schechter Institute. It is symbolic that one institute is in New York and the other in Jerusalem. These are two vital historic centers of Jewish activity throughout the ages. I think Just as the thinkers who came up with the idea of the state of Israel, they had the vision of a Jewish state, and they would be proud with our success. They would be proud too of the success of the Schechter Institute. The Schechter Institute has its roots in the JTS. This is an academic pluralistic institute that is Israeli to the core. It enables people from all walks of life to come study the Jewish sources in a critical, academic, open-minded way. For the past 30, 40 years, we've been a small institute on a hilltop in Jerusalem, just a few dozens of students. This is what you would have seen 30 or 40 years ago. Now, at the threshold of the 21st century, you see hundreds of people coming to the Schechter Institute, thronging to participate in all our programs. People come from all over Israel. Some even come from the US, from South America, from Europe and elsewhere. The vision of the founding fathers and mothers, their vision has been a wild success. The Schechter Institute has a deep imprint in Israeli society and contributes on a daily basis to the ongoing dialogue and discussion between Israel and the diaspora. This conference is our second annual conference focusing on the dialogue between Jews in Israel and in North America, focusing on the question, what is it to be a Jew in the state of Israel? This seems obvious, but it isn't. And what does it mean to be a Jew in North America, in the US and Canada? What are the differences? What are the commonalities? What does each community confront? What does each community have in common with the others here in Israel and in America? So the basic question is, how can we bridge the gap? How can we strengthen the ties between the two communities that have been drifting apart for some years? Let me tell you of a trauma I experienced 5 months ago. On a Shabbat morning on October 27th, 2018, Robert Bowers entered the conservative synagogue Etz Chaim in Pittsburgh and murdered in cold blood 11 worshipers who were taking part in the Shacharit services. This incident left an impact that is still not quite understood. We experienced solidarity here in Israel with our fellow Jews in North America. The thriving, successful, prosperous community experienced this murderous terror attack, just as Israel has experienced so many terror attacks. Suddenly, a new part of our shared experience is now understood, the suffering on both sides of the Atlantic. Israel has been suffering terror attacks for so many years, and now all of a sudden there's a balance, and America is suffering from terror too. Jews in the diaspora, including in America, are sometimes told, well, this just proves that you have to make Aliyah and come to Israel right away. Some people even quoted the book of Genesis, where God says to Abraham, leave your house, leave your homeland, leave your family, and go to Canaan. But in reality, the picture is much more complex now and historically. All of you here either made Aliyah or your parents made Aliyah. Some came to Israel from Europe, some from the US. In my family, in 1837, Moshe Aaron came to Jerusalem. He was about 25. He came from Kremser in what is today the Czech Republic. He came to Israel and to Jerusalem, and then his descendants moved to other areas in Jerusalem. He was my great-great-grandfather, and they prayed next year in Jerusalem. What would have happened if he hadn't decided to make Aliyah at such an early age? What would have happened to the Baumgarten family? Where would they be in the second half of the 19th century? Ellis Island, Buenos Aires? Maybe they would have remained in Moravia, and their fate would be to perish like so many millions. My personal story is just one thread in our common history. The question we are addressing is, where should Jews be? Do we have to encourage Jews to leave the diaspora and make Aliyah? I think that most of the leaders here in Israel and most of the people here in Israel do think so, but I don't agree. Despite the fact that I am a Zionist, I was born here in Jerusalem and I love Israel. Despite all our problems, I do not think that the only solitary, legitimate place for a Jew to reside is here in the state of Israel. Jews can reside in communities in many places, and each hour, each day, leaders and Jews are forging a Jewish identity, and they have the right to impact their cultural surroundings and develop as Jews. We are seeing people who disagree with these liberal thoughts. There are fascist thoughts and fascist people among us, people who hate the other. There is intolerance, inability to listen, inability to accept the fact that someone has a different opinion, and we experience hatred and incitement. This impacts, and not in a good way, the religious liberties, freedom of worship and religious freedom here in Israel. And we are experiencing the same thing that Jews have experienced in other places in the world. This is why this conference is so important here today. It's important for us to understand the way people feel about Jewish identity here in Israel and in the US and Canada. I'm sure that the many talks we will be hearing will relate to points we agree on and points we disagree on. I hope we will add to the understanding and knowledge on the subject of ties between Israel and the diaspora, and the Schechter Institute and the JTS will continue to cooperate and contribute to bridge the gaps between the two communities. Before I end, let me thank all those who have made this conference possible. I'd like to thank Mary and Saul Sanders, Bob Rifkind. These people made this conference possible thanks to their generosity. I thank the Keren Kayemet for supporting and sponsoring us. Dr. Moti Friedman of KKL has been supporting us for many years here at the Schechter Institute. I thank Professor Arnold Eisen and Professor David Golinkin for working hard to make this conference possible, Professor Ari Ackerman for the academic work, the Schechter Institute staff that's been working hard, and all the speakers. I thank you all. I wish us all many years of peace and prosperity and hard work and study here in Israel and in other places, at the JTS and at the Schechter Institute. Both of these places are devoted to making Jewish study pluralistic, open, and liberal. This is what we do in our work on a daily basis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bar. Now I have the honor to present the chairperson of the next session, who has been in the Schechter Institute for over the last four years, the dean of the Beit Midrash. He does excellent work, very extensive work. He brings in many new students and many new programs, and he has certainly caused the Beit Midrash to prosper over the last few years by offering a very rich program. This year he opened a program for 50 students that learn about prayers and different versions, different types of prayer in three different tracks. Professor Avi Novus Deutsch, please go ahead. This session will focus on the subject of the Vital Religious Center in Israel and in North America. We have 4 very important speakers. Each will speak for up to 20 minutes, I hope a little bit less, so that we'll also have time to have a discussion. I want to share a few thoughts of my own that I would like the speakers to address. Maybe they'll address those issues directly or maybe indirectly, and issues that aren't mentioned, that aren't discussed during this session will probably be discussed later on this evening. One of these studies that I find fascinating and unique is by Yaakov Yidger, who studied the concept of conservatism in Israel from the traditional religion that we usually attribute to people who originate from the Eastern countries, people who don't dare to tell at their workplace to say that they are traditional because they're assumed to be religious, but they're not entirely religious, and maybe they may not admit that they don't answer the phone on Shabbat or that they eat only kosher because they're perceived as secular. And when we tell the Israeli story, and I think that you'll hear more about this during the next session from Shmuel Rosner, Israel, for a long time, Israel told a very binary story that there are secular Jews and religious Jews, or ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox, and secular, and the concept of traditional Judaism, from that perspective, was somewhat illegitimate. It existed, but it wasn't something that was really up for discussion. I think that we're in a slightly different era now, and I think that one of the questions that I ask is about this loyalty, this traditional practice of Jewish customs and commandments without the complete commitment. Can this be associated with the Vital Religious Center? And the second question that I would like to address is a question that was a very important part of my conversation with the members of this panel, is what are the boundaries of the religious center? I think that the concept of the Vital Religious Center is one that I attribute to Dr. Eisen, but I'm not to Professor Eisen, but I'm not sure who exactly it includes and who is not included. Is modern Orthodoxy part of this center? Is the Reform movement part of this movement, of this center? Where exactly do the boundaries lie? The third question is that we talk about a center, maybe we're claiming ownership of a certain point, or maybe if it's a sociological description. The question is does that describe Judaism in Israel or Judaism in the United States? And the final question that I will demonstrate in 3 sentences. My friend, the dean of the Rabbinical Center in Los Angeles, Rabbi Bredhart, said that you're pluralistic about issues that aren't really genuinely important to you. And it seems to me that the argument of the center, of the religious center, is somewhere in the middle, somewhat parav in the middle, saying that the boundaries aren't so critical for me, and maybe that also could be associated with the previous question about boundaries. And with regard to this question, there was a call for papers about an upcoming conference who's interested in passionate moderacy. And this is a very different question, the opposite question to this parv type of approach. Where is this religious center passionate, and where is it more, where is it less passionate? That's the end of my opening remarks, and now we will introduce the speakers in the order that they appear on the program. We will begin with Professor Arnie Eisen, who has already been introduced, so I can test you and see if you were listening. But I will introduce him in only one way, not physically, because I'm not holding the physical copy, but during the break, you will be able to hold the hard copy of a booklet that he published about conservative Judaism. It was translated very, very recently into Hebrew, and it is available. It will hopefully be outside in the upcoming break if the instructions that I gave do indeed work out. And hopefully it's possible that today he's possibly one of the most important philosophers in the world of conservative Judaism, and I would like to give him the stage. So I didn't prepare a formal lecture. I'll just say a few sentences about each and every word. We'll start with the concept, the term itself, what we call the vital religious center, and then I'll focus on each and every one of these words. What is vital, what is religious, and what is center? Because of my despite my jet lag, I hope to speak Hebrew throughout the entire conference. We'll see what happens. The JTS leaders have always felt that our institute serves a very broad spectrum of U.S. Jewry, not only Jews who call themselves conservative. Schechter, who included America in the title of the JTS, he called it JTS of America. He didn't mean to say that it was located in America, not in Breslev, meaning that he meant that this would be the Jewish seminar of all U.S. Jewry, regardless of their affiliation. He believed that JTS itself was vital for Catholic Israel. That was an important concept that he coined. A much broader group that included more than one denomination. When Schechter established in the conservative movement in 1913, he established the United Synagogue of America. That speech, that establishment speech, always talked about conservative and orthodox. Whenever he said the word conservative, he always added the words or orthodox. Figurstein, on the other hand, allocated an enormous percentage. Whenever I look at the JTS budgets from those times, he dedicated an enormous percentage of the JTS budget to initiatives such as the radio and television programs, the Institute for Religious and Social Studies, and the Jewish Museum, and of course the fantastic Jewish Library at JTS. None of these initiatives serve a single denomination of U.S. Jewry. It was very multi-denominational, and based on this history, when we developed and formulated a strategic plan to guide us over the last decade, we talked about the close bonds between JTS and the conservative movement, and we also talked about the Vital Religious Center, meaning that JTS wants to contribute not only to the conservative movement, but to all of U.S. Jewry. And this concept, Vital Religious Center, was invented by our consultant for our strategic project, Jack Euclides, and I accepted it immediately, and we use it all the time. It's very important to us. It's not just a slogan. We dedicate budgets to serve the broader public of U.S. Jewry, and not only to the members of the conservative movement, despite the tight bonds between the Vital Jewish Center and the conservative movement. So let's begin with with one clear distinction between the Jewish community in Israel and the Jewish community in the United States. And that can be that is associated with the concept of religious in the title of our center. In the United States, Jews who are not Orthodox generally do not define themselves as religious versus secular. They don't define themselves or they define themselves as secular. They don't use the concepts of secular or religious. It's true that according to the Pew report of
Yeah, 2013,
2013, 78% of the Jews fall under under the definition of JBR, Jews by religion. How did that reach that number? You pick up the phone, they ask you have a religion, they say which religion, they say Jewish, and then they define you as Jews by religion. If you say you don't have a religion, they ask you, do you have any affiliation to any ethnical group or any traditional group or any cultural group? You say yes. That you say yes, Jewish. Then the answer is, then they define you as JNR, Jew not by religion. There is a correlation, a very powerful and tight correlation between Jews by religion and all other Jewish activity, whether it's education or affiliation with a synagogue, sending children to Jewish summer camps, ties with Israel. If you are a Jew not by religion, it's very likely that you are not affiliated in any way with any type of Jewish activity, and you are not a member of any Jewish organization. So that's what's interesting about. What's interesting is that they asked the Jews by religion, JBR, if religion is the most vital component of your Jewish identity. And I asked this question in many different conservative synagogues on Saturday morning, on Shabbat morning, over the course of the year after the Pew report was published, and I found exactly what they found, that between 2/3 and 75% of the Jews who are Jewish by religion say no, religion is not the most vital component of their Jewish identity. Family, history, culture, ties with Israel, etc., but not religion, meaning that Jews who define themselves as religious declare that religion is not the most important part of their identity, and that shouldn't be very surprising. Jews in the United States over the last century define themselves and describe themselves to others and to themselves as a religious group and also as an ethnic group. We are a religious group, like Protestants or Catholics, but we are also an ethnical group, like the Italian Americans, African Americans, Latinos, etc. And how do we describe ourselves? It depends on context. It depends on the context of the question. Mordechai Kaplan wrote in his book, Judaism as a Civilization, that the definition of Judaism as a religion and the synagogue as the main Jewish institute was an enormous mistake, but an inevitable one. In a Protestant country, we would not have received rights otherwise. We would not have been accepted. We would not have been allowed to join society unless we defined ourselves as a religion, because the United States is a Protestant country when it comes down to it. And an American Constitution guarantees the rights of each and every religion, but for an ethnic group and tradition does not have any protection of their rights, meaning that there was no choice. And the Jews accepted that. And Kaplan and others, as you know, immediately after the First World War, they tried to organize the Jews in New York as a society, as a community. Yehuda Magnus was also involved in creating the Jewish community, and that failed, not only because of the failure and the lack of cooperation of the Jewish population, whether the Orthodox or the secular, but the non-Jews were also unwilling to see the Jews as a separate society, and the Jews were not interested. Kaplan thought that anyone who is born should receive a card at the hospital that says it defines him as Jewish. And that card, this card will give you rights to education, recreational facilities,
even health systems, everything.
health systems, burial, everything. Therefore, he didn't want there to be synagogues. He wanted to have JCCs, and the JCCs would address religious needs on Shabbat. There would be separate rooms for Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. If they wanted to pray separately, they could have separate rooms. You didn't need synagogues. All you need is Jewish community centers, because we're not a religion. And it's inappropriate for Jews to define themselves based on Protestant terms and not based on Jewish terms. This proposal was obviously not accepted, and we remain a religion and also an ethnic group. But Kaplan was a rabbi. He was a professor at JTS. He was a rabbi. He prayed 3 times a day. So later on, when he defined Judaism as civilization, he defined it as a religious civilization, a developing religious civilization. We're not only a culture, we are, of course, a religion as well. Abi Yoshua also said something that's very well known, that we are Jews, as Jews we are neurotic. We're Jews, we're neurotic because we define ourselves as an ethnic group and also as a religious group. I agree that we're neurotic, but not for that reason. There are many reasons for our neurosis. But there is something to it. There is a bit of truth to that statement. He pinpointed something very interesting. The average Jew in the United States, the non-Orthodox Jew, the Jews, the Reform and Conservative Jews that I know in the United States that are not affiliated with any, and Jews that are not affiliated with any movement, don't want to define themselves as religious, because they affiliate that with Christianity, and they affiliate religious Judaism to people wearing black, and that's not something that they can identify with. Many Jews in the United States believe in God, based on, as Heschel explains it, or as Kaplan explains the concept. It doesn't matter how, but they do feel close bonds with civil religion of Jews in our era, which is the people of Israel. It's not that they don't have religious emotions, but they are not willing to define themselves as religious. And the word secular also is not something that they use to define themselves. They don't define themselves as secular. The culture is secular. Broadway, television is secular. Hollywood is secular. Universities are secular. But the Jews themselves do not generally define themselves as secular. They define themselves as Jews. They know that that means an affiliation with a nation, with a religion, but that's not how the Jews will define themselves normally. Now I will move on to the word center. It's slightly more problematic than religious, but I wouldn't say that it's necessarily clear. To the Jews in the United States, center does not indicate a center point between religious and secular, but rather between ultra-Orthodox and assimilation. Meaning being at the center means that you belong, meaning that you define yourself as a Jew. You're not assimilated, you're not disappearing, but you're also not Orthodox and certainly not ultra-Orthodox. Even an Israeli that argues, that claims that he's not Jewish, someone who eats pork on Yom Kippur, and I understand that there are people like that, and defines himself as a Buddhist, not a Jew. Even this Israeli, I think, will not entirely disappear. I don't think he can ever really escape the Jewish history or the Jewish people. The fact that he's represented here, he opens his mouth, he lives in Israel, he opens his mouth and speaks Hebrew, he's recruited by the IDF, he pays taxes to the government of the state of Israel. That claims him. It's something that he can't escape. He can't escape from that identity. What is most concerning, in my opinion, the worst part, in my opinion, about the Pew report seems to be this fact, the fact that in the United States today, there are over 2 million people who have at least one Jewish parent, and if you ask them if you're a Jew, they say no. There are 2 million people of this kind. Jews in the United States, I'm talking about Jews in the United States, 2 million, meaning that we have maybe 6 million people who define themselves as Jews, but there are additional 2 million that have at least one Jewish parent that do not define themselves as Jewish. So right now, they manage to escape from their Jewish identity. And the greatest challenge that we face regarding the millennials, and it's hard to talk about them because the data is still very new and they're still in their 30s, but if you ask the millennials if they're Jewish, from the ethnic perspective of the word, they say no. So Judaism to them is only a religion, because otherwise they're chauvinistic or nationalistic or even racist. But if asked if they're religious, they'll say, no, I don't believe in God, so I'm not religious. So we reached a paradoxical point where, unlike Kaplan, and more like what Moshe Mendelssohn said, is that if Judaism is a religion like Christianity or like Islam, and they don't want to define themselves as religious, then there is a risk that we will lose them as Jews. Part of the power in the word center is the claim that there is no need to abandon, to not be intellectual in order to cling to Judaism. You can still be affiliated with other groups and still be a member of our group. Center means that we're opening an opportunity to be both. You don't have to choose. It's not either or. And this also applies to the realm of denominations. Orthodox Jews are generally very happy to differentiate themselves from other Jews. They believe that they're right and the others are wrong, that we're sinners, that we're not non-believers, and they generally put the conservative Jews into the same group as Reform groups, and they say there is no substantial difference between the two. There are liberal Jews and there are traditional Jews. I hear this from Reform Jews as well, who want to claim some type of legitimization that they're Jewish like the conservatives. The fact that we're not Orthodox, okay, but you're not Orthodox either, and we are just as legitimate as you are. As a conservative Jew, and also as a researcher of Judaism in the New Era, I tend to divide the population into 3 groups instead of 2. Should I translate it to English and to Hebrew? I don't know what to do. אז אנחנו נתקלים בשני דברים שאנחנו מדברים על המרכז הדתי. For most Jews in the United States, religion is associated with the fringes of life, of American life, the extreme margins, the fringes of life. At the center is secular culture that is dominant in the universities, in the media, in the consumerism, and in normal and everyday lives. He's speaking in English.
Reflected their ways more than it does. Most Americans are Protestants or Catholics who call themselves religious. The biggest group in America, of course, are religious Protestants. But most Americans
He switched to English.
do not want to see religion dominate the culture or the society. They find space for themselves, doctrine in the fact that the culture is punitively secular. It is mutual. This is a Protestant Kaplan understood. Jews in America are free to develop our culture, our tradition, our community, our religion, precisely by the fact that we are a small minority tolerated by the larger society. And the larger society is pledged to support all kinds of religion and not just one kind. There is a further paragraph to the word center, that religion is not central to the self of most American Jews, and neither is Judaism, which lives on the margins of who they are. The Jewish language, walks the streets and landscapes of the land of Israel, and is surrounded largely by other Jews. He or she feels a strong connection to Jewish history and knows that the state of Israel is the continuation of that history. The opposite is the case for American Jews outside Haredi neighborhoods. Words of Torah are not inscribed al mezuzot beiteinu, beitehem, batehem, ubesharehem. Heschel, kedei להתגבר על הבעיה הזאת,
In order to overcome this problem, Heschel proposed that Jews devote the time and not the space. He switched back to English. And finally, I want to address the vital in the name of the center. And when I talk about the word vital, in the Vital Religious Center, I want to emphasize that I disagree with the common consensus that the conservative movement will disappear within a few decades. As he switched back to English again.
Affiliated Jews in America belong to conservative synagogues. 11% according to the Pew Report, which is between 600 and 700,000 Jews. This is over 25% of the Jews who belong to any kind of religious denomination in the United States. This is not nothing. Orthodoxy has less than 10% of American Jews. Reform has 14%. Add them all up, you get around 36%. Reconstructionism, maybe 1%. So we are not doing badly now. I want to emphasize this because when people predict an imminent disappearance, too many conservative Jews believe them. This is bad for morale, it's bad for fundraising, it's bad for the solidarity one requires, and we must stand up against this. But the numbers themselves do not tell the whole story. Yes, 20 or 30 years from now, there will be fewer conservative Jews. And this is one of the reasons why Jewish day schools are working to attract non-conservative Jews, Jews who are not conservative, and they're succeeding. Something like 30% of the students in Schechter schools, or students in schools that were Schechter schools, are now not conservative, many of them Orthodox. The same thing with Camp Ramah. 30% of the campers are not conservative. JTS attracts many students that are not conservative Jews, right? So this is where this Vital Religious Center lives. This Vital Religious Center becomes more important. The second problem with going by the numbers is that the numbers don't tell you most of the important things that one wants to understand about Jews or any other religious groups. And as a person who studies the situation of religion in the United States, I'm heartened by all the critics of the quantitative surveys that are out there. The Christians are criticizing them just as much. Yes, the Protestants have lost 12% of their members in the last 12 years. This is very serious. And this, to my mind, is largely responsible for the Jews losing members, right? If Christians are not going to church, less chance that Jews will go to synagogue. But the question we want to answer is, what are Jews doing when they do go to synagogue? Why are they going? What meaning do they find there? You can't say, do you believe in God? Yes, no, maybe. And that's precisely what the surveys ask. Do you believe in God? Yes, no, maybe. It's a ridiculous question. It should not be asked. So what one wants to know is, what meaning do people find in what they're getting? What does belief in God mean? What meaning does Jewish life have for you? And I would suggest, Avi, I now move to the conclusion, that as a lifelong conservative Jews, much of what Judaism means to me comes through the experiences I've had of Judaism that are precious, that came to me by way of conservative Judaism and would have been different had I not been a conservative Jew. So when I think of the word vital religious center, I don't limit that to conservative Judaism. Yes, of course, to me, in answer to the obvious question, it includes many Jews who don't call themselves conservative. And I respect those Jews, and there is a true pluralism here. These things are very important to me, but I know that not all the right is on my side. But when I think about the way I studied Jewish sources at Gratz College in Philadelphia with Arnie Bender and others, and the way I was taught that I had a seat at the table now, that there were many opinions in Judaism, there had always been many opinions in Jewish history, and that our chance now was through our learning and through our action to enter into that conversation and become part of it. And there was a pluralism in that presentation which was precious to me. It opened my mind and my soul and kept me a Jew. And when I discovered Minyan Ma'at in New York City, when I came back to America in 1978, a Chavurah Minyan, I could not have described to you the kind of minyan I wanted, but I knew that that was it, what I wanted. And I know that when my daughter was bat mitzvahed, and I experienced it at the moment, as she's leading the service, leading the Shacharit service, and reading from the Torah, and giving a learned Dvar Torah, and I knew that that bat mitzvah could not have happened in a Reform synagogue, and could not have happened in an Orthodox synagogue, and I was grateful to that synagogue for giving her and me the opportunity to experience Judaism in this way. And I knew that when I, it couldn't have happened in Reform in America, in very few Reform synagogues. I don't think so. The learning would have been different, but this is an argument I have with my friend Nami Kalman all the time. Right. America is a different place. And finally, I want to say that when my mother passed away, the way that the funeral and the Shiva were conducted, the things that were said to me by other Jews, there was a distinctive way of speaking about this that was true of a conservative synagogue that was different than other synagogues in America that I'd been to. I meet hundreds of conservative Jews every year as the chancellor of JTS, and I've come to understand the way that conservative Jews think about their Judaism in the world, and it's something that the surveys don't count. For instance, did you know that by far the great majority of leaders, lay leaders and professional leaders, in every Jewish organization in America, AIPAC, Federation, JCCs, Jewish Studies, I go down the list, Hadassah, American Jewish Committee, the great majority of these leaders are in fact conservative. Pew Report doesn't capture that. I go to a synagogue on Shabbat morning and I meet the head of the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency from New Jersey, and I say to him, why are you doing this? And he said, because I'm a Jew. My Judaism instructs me to do this kind of work. I can go, the mic, I'm sorry I lost the mic. Okay. So,
now I have to conclude, and I apologize for switching from Hebrew to English, but the jet lag was just really bad today. Vital means that Judaism is life-giving. Speaking English again.
Essential to us. I believe that our Judaism is essential to the United States. I believe that the Judaism of the United States is essential to the Judaism of the world, and I believe the Judaism of the world is essential to the world. And I understand the word vital in all these ways. Thank you.
The next speaker is Professor Rabbi David Golinkin, the president of Schechter Institutes, teaches Talmud and Midrash here at the Schechter Institute and at the Rabbinical School here at Schechter. He's written over and edited over 50 books on Midrash, Halacha, and Jewish studies. As part of our book promo, I can say that some of his books are on sale here outside. I'd like to call upon Rabbi Professor David Golinkin. I'd like to define our subject in Hebrew terms, not American terms. In other words, what is a vital religious center? The title of my talk is How to Strengthen the Middle Way in Israel and in North America.
אז אני רוצה לעשות שלושה נושאים.
I have three topics here, actually. What is the middle way in Jewish tradition and why is it vital?
שלוש חושות אפשריות של דרך האמצע.
Three possible ways of understanding the middle way, and three, how to strengthen the middle way in Israel and in North America today.
נתחיל עם דרך האמצע, the middle way.
We begin with the middle way in Jewish tradition and why it is
הרעיון
vital.
הבסיסי
The basic
של דרך
idea
האמצע כבר נאמר
of the
במקרא,
middle way
באחד
already
הפסוקים
appears in the
בספר קהלת,
Bible
פרק
in
ז', אל
Kohelet.
תהי צדיק הרבה ואל
It says,
תתחכם יותר, למה תשומם?
Don't try to outdo others, don't try to be too
טוב
clever.
אשר תאחוז בזה,
It is
וגם מזה אל
best
תנח את
to
ידיך,
do a
כי
bit
ירא
of this
אלוהים
and a bit of
יצא
that,
מכולם.
because if you
והרטום
believe in
בפירושו
God,
הקלאסי,
you
הכוונה לא כסותו, אלא הרטום,
do the best.
אומר,
Hartum, in his commentary,
התרחק מכל מיני
interprets these
קיצוניות,
verses to
לך
say,
בדרך הממוצעת,
be moderate in all things,
שביל הזהב הוא ביטוי נהדר,
take
אבל
the
הוא לא
golden way.
ביטוי
The
עברי.
golden way is
הרעיון
not
הזה נמצא
a
בצורה
Hebrew
מפורשת יותר
term.
בספרות
This
חז"ל,
appears in
ושם
Chazal
הוא
as
נקרא
well,
להלך באמצע,
and they use
או
the
להלך
term
בינתיים.
walking in the middle or walking between the two. This is in Tosefta Chagiga. The context there is the four who entered the Pardes, entered the grove. They say this is like a street between
אחד של אור, אש, ואחד
fire
של
on
שלג.
one side and snow on the other.
נקבע באור,
If you
ניטע לכאן נקבע
veer
בשלג,
too close to the
מה
fire,
עליו
you
על
get
האדם?
scorched. If you veer
להלך
too close to the
באמצע.
snow,
ובלבד שלא
you
יהי נוטה,
freeze.
לא לכאן.
what can a
לא לכאן.
person do? All a
רעיון
person
דומה
can do is
בירושלמי
take the
חגיגה,
middle way. The
בסוגיה על
Yerushalmi
מעשה מרכבה.
Talmud has something similar about
התורה הזאת
the
דומה לשני שבילים, אחד של
Merkava
אור ואחד של שלג.
and speaks about
ניטע בזה
fire
מת
and
באור,
snow.
ניטע בזו
If you
מת
go
בשלג.
too close to the fire,
יעשה?
you get burnt.
ילך
If you go
באמצע.
too close to the snow, you
גם
freeze. So
באבות
what
רבי
should you
נתן,
do? You
נוסף
walk
א',
down the
מהדורת
middle
שופטים,
road.
יש
In
התייחסות
Avot Rabbi
לנושא הזה.
Natan, we have
ושם
another
הנושא הוא
angle on the same
דברי תורה
issue.
לעומת
The
דרך
context there
ארץ.
is derech eretz, or
שהיא עוברת בין
good
שני דרכים,
behavior
כלומר,
vis-a-vis the
משל מה
study
הדבר
of Torah.
דומה? רחוב
There,
עובר בין שני דרכים,
the
אחד של
allegory
אור
is
ואחד של שלג.
a street,
עם
once
ההלך
again,
וכולי, עם ההלך
between
וכולי, כיצד יעשה?
fire on the one
ילך
side and
בינתיים.
snow on the other. What should a person do? Walk
ייזהר
the middle
בעצמו
way
שלא יתחבא
and
באור
take care
ושלא
not to be
ילקה
scorched by fire
בצנעה.
and not to be frozen by ice.
במדרש אחר בספרי
Another
במדבר,
midrash
יש מינוח
on
אחר, לא דרך
Bamidbar
האמצע,
says,
ושם
this is
זה
not
מדרש
the
על
middle
דמות
way.
מי
This
המנורה
midrash
יאיר
takes a
ישיבת
different
המנורות, פרשת
angle.
בהעלותך.
We're talking about the menorah
שלושה
in
כלפי
Parshat
מזרח, זה
Bahalotcha.
תיאור של המנורה.
It says
שלושה
about the
כלפי
menorah,
מזרח,
3
כלפי
towards
מערב,
the center,
ואחד
3 towards
באמצע.
west, 3
נמצאו כולם
towards
מקבילים
the
את
middle,
האמצעי.
so they are
וכאן
all
רבי נתן
parallel.
אומר,
What does
האמצעי
Rabbi
מכובד,
Natan say? He
הולכים
says
נוסף
the
אחר,
middle is the
האמצעי
best,
משובח.
or the middle is
מה קרה
superior.
למושג הזה בימי הביניים?
In the Middle
אני רוצה
Ages, they
להביא
took this
שלושה
term
מקורות.
of the middle.
קודם
Let
רבי
me give you
בכיה
3
אבן
sources.
פקודה
Rabbi
בחובות
Bachya
הלבבות,
ibn Pekuda
והוא
in
מצטט את
Chovot
הפסוק
HaLevavot
שציטטתי מקהלת,
quotes the verse from
וקורא לזה לא
Kohelet,
דרך האמצע,
and
אלא
he calls
הדרך
this not the
השווה.
middle way, but the
טוב אשר
equal
תאחוז
way.
בזה וגם מזה אל תנח את ידיך.
do
רוצה
this
לומר,
and
אל
do
תפליג
that.
בדרכי
In
הצדיקים
other words,
הפורשים מן העולם,
don't
וכן
be
אל תפליג בדרכי
extra
הרשעים
pious on the one
המגבירים
hand
את העולם,
and don't be
שמדגישים
wicked
יותר
on
מדי
the
את
other
העולם.
hand. Don't take the
אחוז
extreme
הדרך
path,
השווה.
take the middle
בתרגום
path, the
האנגלי של
moderate
הרב
path.
משה חיימסון,
The English
שאגב לימד
translation
ב-JTS בתחילת
of
המאה ה-20,
Chaim Sons, and he
תרגם
taught
את
in the
הביטוי,
20s in
"Keep to the middle
JTS,
of the road."
he says keep to the
הדרך
middle of the
השווה.
road. That's his translation.
הרמב"ם כידוע התייחס
The
לנושא הזה
Rambam, as we
באריכות
know,
בהלכות
addressed
דעות
this topic at
של
great
המשנה
length
תורה,
in the
וגם
Mishneh Torah in
בפירושו
Deot
בפרקי
and in
אבות
his
ובכל
commentary to Pirkei Avot.
במשנה תורה הוא קורא
In Mishneh
לדבר
Torah,
הזה
he calls
הדעה
this
הבינונית.
the
אני לא יכול להקריא את כל
middle
הקטע, זה ארוך מדי.
thought or the
יש,
middle idea.
שתי קצוות
I
הרחוקות
can't
זו
go
מזו,
into it
שבכל
at great
דעה
length
ודעה
here. He
אינן
says
דרך טובה,
the extreme
ראוי
of
לו
any
לאדם
opinion
ללכת
is
בהם,
not
ולא
good. Do
ללמדם
not take the
לעצמו.
extreme path.
הדרך
The
הישרה
best
היא
thing
מידה
to do
בינונית,
is to take
שבכל
the
דעה
middle
ודעה,
path, the moderate
מכל הדעות
approach,
שיש לו לאדם. והיא
and
הדעה
follow
שהיא
that.
רחוקה משתי הקצוות.
which is furthest from each extreme, and so
במקור
forth.
חדש, בשבילי,
In a
מצאתי
new source,
עכשיו,
new to me, that I
וזה
found
בפירושו
recently,
של רבי עובדיה
this is in
ספורנו,
Rabbi Ovadia Sforno's
Xukot,
commentary on
פרשת
Parashat
פרה אדומה,
Chukat,
במדבר, פרק
Parah
י"ט.
Adumah in
זה קטע מאוד
Bamidbar.
ארוך,
This is
אני
a
רק
very
מצטט
long
משפט אחד.
passage. I'll quote just a
שלישית, ראוי
single
להתבונן
sentence. He says,
שבהיות כל אמרת
third,
אלוהה צרופה היא בלי ספק
any believer
מיישרת
who truly
המעשים
believes
אל המיצוע.
should
עברית מאוד קשה.
do every act the middle way, in the moderate way. He uses the word mitzua, which is connected to emtza, the middle, because each extreme is
ונעקש דרכים ייפול
offensive.
באחת, כלומר, מי שעקום
Anyone
בשתי הדרכים ייפול בבת אחת.
trying to follow an
ולכן,
extremist
דברי
path
השם או
will
הדרך של
not
השם
succeed.
מיישרת
Following
את
the
המעשים.
moderate way, the middle ground, that is the mitzua, the emtza, the
הרבה הוגי דעות שהדגישו את המושג
moderate
הזה.
path. Many thinkers have taken up this theme. Rabbi Nachman Krochmal, the Maskil, the Jewish philosopher, died in 1840. He quoted Yerushalmi Chagiga that I mentioned before in his volume Moreh Nevochei Hazman.
גישתו לנושא סוכמה בצורה פיקנטית על ידי פרופסור שכטר.
Professor Schechter,
ואני
Solomon
מתנצל
Schechter,
באנגלית.
summed up
What then
his
must he do?
attitude as
Must walk
follow,
in the
and the
middle, or as we
speaker is
should say,
speaking in
he must
English.
choose the golden mean. But as Krochmal suggests, the middle way in
The quote
historical
is in
and
English.
philosophical doubts does not consist,
You
as
can
some
listen
idle heads
directly to the
suppose,
speaker.
in a kind of compromise between two opposing views. If one of two contending parties declares that twice two makes six, while his opponent asserts that twice two makes eight, a sort of compromise might be arrived at by conceding that twice two makes seven. But such a compromise would be as false as either extreme, and the seeker after the truth must revert to the mean במובן של middle, which is the heart of all things, independently of all factions, placing himself above them. כלומר, פשרה בין שתי דעות
In other words,
נכונות,
a
היא עדיין לא
compromise between
נכונה.
two wrong opinions is yet another wrong opinion. We don't need a compromise. What we need is the mean, the middle. Zachariah Frankel and the Breslau school believed in this middle way. Professor Mordechai Breuer explains this as follows. The moderate way of the Breslau school was often termed the juste milieu. In other words, right in the middle. This term was used in France in the mid-19th century to characterize the school of thought that opposed reactionaries and revolutionaries. Hermann Cohen used the term the theologian of moderate thought. Professor Schechter, too, the founder of JTS and of the conservative movement, and we call our institute after him, the Schechter Institute. In 1913, he addressed this issue in a letter to Louis Marshall. Translating him into Hebrew brings the Rambam's influence to light. The JTS has to establish a conservative school that is far from radicalism and from hyper-orthodoxy. This institute should take the middle way. So much for the important sources from the Bible, the rabbis, the Middle Ages, and the modern era. There are three possible claims against this approach. One, we could claim that this is a non-Jewish concept because we got it from other sources. For example, Aristotle influenced the Rambam. Aristotle talks about the middle way of morals and ethics. The middle is the best, it is superior, this is perfection. Likewise, we could say that Schechter, who lived in England for 20 years before he moved to the US, was influenced by the Anglican Church. Recently, this was claimed by Matthew Legrand. In 1937, 50 years before Schechter came to England, John Henry Newman wrote that the Anglican Church is the via media, in other words, the middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism. Schechter, following this criticism, could be accused of taking up the Anglican approach. So we could say, so what? Many approaches in Judaism are influenced by others, and the Rambam himself said the truth is the truth, no matter who said it. The Hammurabi laws impacted the Bible. The 13 hermeneutical principles were influenced by Hellenistic philosophy. Aristotle and influenced Rav Sadia Gaon, and liturgy and liturgical poetry, piyutim, were influenced by Arabic poetry. That's fine. Judaism was always influenced by its surroundings and integrated and incorporated other thought into itself. In the 19th century, Zachariah Frankel and the Breslau School of Thought were ridiculed. Professor Mordechai Breuer explains their ridicule as follows. He said, many Orthodox people think that instead of identifying with one of the two schools of Judaism, they ridicule the Breslau school. Hildesheimer said, if you follow the middle way, you are ridiculed. On both sides of the street, on the right and on the left, people are walking, and only horses walk in the middle. This is something that Hildesheimer said, ridiculing Frankel. This is from Tosefta Bava Kama, saying that a horse or a cow walks in the middle of the street while people walk on the side. Hildesheimer used Tosefta Bava Kama to ridicule Tosefta Chagiga that we quoted earlier. This is extremely clever, but there isn't really anything to ridicule. Bava Kama is talking about a street in the Mishnaic period when cows and horses walked in the middle of the road, but Tosefta Chagiga is talking about way of life for people, not cows, and that's why it talks about walking in the middle of the road. In politics, in religion, in philosophy, the middle road can't survive. This is what Yeats had to say. W.B. Yeats wrote the following in the poem The Second Coming exactly 100 years ago in 1919. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And now the speaker is translating that into Hebrew.
ואילו הרשעים מלאים עוצמה לוהטת. אכן,
and this is what happens in Israeli politics. Most of the middle of the way parties are no longer in existence. Dash, Shinui, Kadima, they disappeared. And this perhaps is what's happening to the conservative movement or modern orthodoxy, that according to the Pew report that we heard, they are losing ground. This is happening to Protestant middle-of-the-road streams as well. This is what Professor Schechter had to say, complaining in that 1913 letter. And I quote the end of the letter. He's talking about the JTS as the middle between the two extremes. He says, taking the middle has no chance of gaining popular approval, since people like radical acts either on the Orthodox side or on the Reform side. And all we have to say about this is true. It's hard to be in the middle. Maybe it's not popular. That doesn't mean that it isn't the correct thing to do. I agree with Tosefta Chagiga and Sifrei Bamidbar and the Rambam and Bachya ibn Pekudei. Take the middle way, the medium, the mean is superior, and doing the right thing is the best. Ismar Shor said of himself many years ago, I am militant centrist. We just heard that. I am a militant centrist. I am a militant moderate. And I can say the same of myself. It's not a compromise. It is a principled approach, a principled position, and this is the golden mean. I won't have time to address my third issue, the question of how to express this in our daily lives here in Israel and in the US and Canada. I can mention 3 areas. In halakha, halachic rulings and decisions, I looked over the response I've published. I looked over them and I found 7 examples. For example, conversion. I took a middle way between 2 extremes. You can go by the school of Hillel, saying that a convert has to accept only one single commandment. Don't do to others what you don't want others to do unto you. You could say that a ger has to do all the commandments except for one. Or you can take the middle way in Yevamot that says you teach some commandments, some of the easier ones, some of the harder ones. If the convert agrees, you do a Brit Milah. That is the middle way. The Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch both took this path. I think this is how we should rule on Halicha, the middle way and not the extremes. The same goes for education. I cite the example of the book of Joshua. You can teach it as a militant document, even a racist one, as something that gives us justification for the expulsion of Arabs, or we can take the approach of Professor Greenberg that I heard him saying 40 years ago. The rabbis used their midrash on the book of Joshua to reach the middle way. And finally, the political situation here in Israel. We are fighting, we are extremists for the moderate cause here in Israel. We need funding, we need funding here in Israel for our middle of the way, for our moderate stream. We need moderate liberal education to be funded by the government of Israel. Dr. Eitan Shikli, the director of Tali, has been writing about this for many, many years and strongly criticizing the government. We can't do this on our own. We need government funding here in Israel from the government. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third speaker, and soon we'll determine whether she's part of the middle ground or not, Professor Tova Hartman, Dean of Humanities at the Academic College of Ono, and head of the Shitufim Institute in Jerusalem. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. I will respond to both of the speakers that preceded me as someone who is actively not affiliated with the Schechter Institute, but is very familiar and appreciative of everything that I've learned and everything that I continue to learn and gain from the Schechter Institute. I will talk about the middle way. I will talk about the center. I think it's very important that you talk about the center, and even if you quote Maimonides, don't forget all of the places where he talks about the Chassid. And he talks about the Chassid in the 8 chapters and in all other places.
It's a little more dizzying. It's not like we're like this, but it's a little more complex.
It's more complex, it's not that straightforward. One of the challenges of the concept of the center of the middle is that you're constantly monitoring the temperature at the extremes. You're constantly comparing yourself with the extremes. Sometimes you lose the your own spiritual center, because you're constantly paying attention, you're constantly aware of whether you're not, making sure that you're not too extreme. And in this type of discourse, I think we're losing a lot of our creativity and a lot of depth. It also takes us to a place where we develop what we call in psychology a negative identity.
I know who I am by who I'm not. And I'm constantly
speaking English.
Who I'm not in order to have an identity. And
I think that when you talked about your daughter's bat mitzvah, or when you said Shiva, there is no need to say that I know that it could not have happened anywhere else. But you would say that it was a significant experience for me. I raised my daughter in a certain way. There was a place in which I was able to act, in which I was able to be creative, and I am very appreciative of this opportunity and of this environment. You can stop there. It doesn't make it any deeper by saying that there would be no other place, not in an Orthodox environment and not in a Reform environment, where this would have been possible. I try, and I'm not always successful, but when we began Shira Chadasha, the egalitarian community, I'm a mother of 3 daughters, and it was very important to me that we would pray in all different types of synagogues, not because they were more or less suitable for us, but because there is sanctity in every place. And we are the ones who have to find that sanctity and create that sanctity, and we have to create it in a place that best suits us, that best suits each and every one of us. If this middle way helps us with that Jewish creativity, then it's wonderful. But I don't want, and I don't feel a need to state that those don't have genuine prayer. It's difficult for me to pray in a certain place with a chandelier. I'm saying it as a joke, but there are many different ways of praying. There are churches that also have sanctity, and we have to realize that. And this middle way that defines us, in which we define ourselves as not this and not here and not there. Switch to English again. I learned several other things from the Shira Chadasha community that I would like to share with you. That is one attempt made by people who are trying to create a religious community. When I began the process, my failed attempt to convince rabbis, I come from the world of modern Orthodoxy, as it's known, and my attempt that seemed so obvious, it seemed so obvious to me that they would agree, because I would show them that there's precedents, and all of the arguments that I had with my father of blessed memory and with others, where I said that feminism didn't come from Mount Sinai, but neither did Kant. And if you understand Judaism through him, that's great. If it makes sense to you.
If you do, that's fine. But there are other ways to understand.
Switch to English again. There are other ways of understanding, but I was convinced that they would understand that just as there's the Jew religious Zionism that also changed different concepts, eventually I realized that no one was willing to help us. And then I said, okay, then I will have to do this before my daughter finishes high school. I want her to see that her mother tried in the face of adversity. And one thing that I heard all along the way was that there is no need. No one needs it. Who do you think you are? But mostly, there was an approach that came from the Pew Report and other processes, other social processes, where you prepare a questionnaire. We ask people to answer my question.
They say yes or no to my question.
They say yes or no to my question, and then I understand if the community is willing to take action in one direction or another. 100 years ago, if women would have been asked if they want to vote, then they would have answered no. Most of the women would say no. We
that quantitative research has not
switch to
not able
English.
Predict not Brexit, not Bibi, and not Trump. So I think we need to. So I think we sort of like try to think that there may be another way in order to us to feel what the Jewish people or what are some of the questions that are there. But
what I learned from my experience with Shira Chadasha was that the role of leadership at times is to create needs without going into the issue of false consciousness. Again, speaking in English.
And then all of a sudden, you see that it was.
And from our experience, if someone comes to Shira Chadasha now, and they'd say, "Where's everyone? It's not such a big community anymore." And then I have to explain that, thank goodness, Shira Chadasha is not a single community in Jerusalem, but there's another similar community every 2 blocks. Again, speaking in English.
Religiously now in Yerushalayim, and people are also, though, creating religiously in America.
Meaning that when you ask about the difference between Israel and the United States regarding religious and secular, I think that along with the alienation of certain groups from Judaism, I think that we must note that in both communities, religious creativity that doesn't ask rabbis. And this is what is very similar between the conservative and the Orthodox denominations, meaning that there's a group that makes the decisions for everyone else. In any case, there is creativity that has significantly grown at the center. And not only at the center, there is religious creativity. And I would like to conclude by saying that I learned a new term, and I'm ashamed to say that I hadn't never heard of before. But I didn't study Rav Ovadia's halachic rulings in depth, but in an attempt to compensate for not being so familiar with Ethiopian Judaism, I began to read his different rulings and how he referred to the Karaite groups. I highly recommend to us that we review some of these issues and some of these halachic rulings, not because of precedents, talk about what we can learn from the Karaites. If the Rav Ovadia permitted, then we can also permit it. And that's not what I'm talking about. The idea is to understand the broad horizons of people who are generally don't appear in our textbooks, not in the seminary, not in not in Yeshiva University, but there was Jewish creativity that is very different, but can provide milestones that are unique to our discourse. And I want to conclude by saying talking about something that he mentioned.
נשאלת השאלה,
When asked the question, part of religious Judaism accepted the approach that you cannot sit next to a table, you cannot sit at a table with someone who violates the Shabbat because he can't pour wine, and there are many different rules that encourage separation. People approached Rav Ovadia and asked if they can have a Shabbat meal. Can my father make Kiddush, even though I know that after Kiddush, after the meal, he's going to drive home? And according to most rulings, he's not allowed this. It's prohibited. And Rav Ovadia made a distinction between what he called people who keep the Shabbat and people who remember Shabbat. People who keep Shabbat are the people that we generally talk about when we talk about people who keep Shabbat. A shomer is someone who keeps Shabbat. A neurotic Jew is someone who follows all the rules. Look at how a religious person makes tea on Shabbat. They accept the halachic rulings that are considered mainstream. But there is also something else about Shabbat that is reflected in the Kiddush process, and these are the people who remember the Shabbat. And what does that mean? What does it mean to remember Shabbat? This I'll leave to you to think about. Does that mean that I constantly live with the awareness of having been created, meaning that I can't destroy the world? To each of us can give our own interpretation. I hope that you'll be very extreme in your ability, in your definition of those who remember the Shabbat.
Thank you. I have a little anecdote to connect Professor Hartman's talk to the next one. There's a clip showing the construction in Tel Aviv at Gesher Yehudit. The construction works on Friday night after Shabbat has already begun, showing the workers eating. One of the workers puts his phone on and reads out the Kiddush and makes Kiddush for everybody. In my approach, going 30 years back, this would seem ridiculous, some sort of mockery of Judaism. Today I realize that this is what people do when they have fond memories of Shabbat from childhood or as part of their Israeli experience. I don't think we'll be able to define the center, but we'll hear what Professor Dalia Marks can do to help us. Professor Marks studies liturgy, and she edited the New Reform Siddur. She teaches at the Hebrew Union College and is author of a recent book on Jewish holidays and festivals, Jewish Israeli holidays and festivals. Professor Marks. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's wonderful to be part of this important conversation. I'm a Reform rabbi. I also study Jewish liturgy. That's why I like to go to different synagogues to pray for the experience. Where I go usually is a Masorati congregation. My Rabbi Chaya, between Kiddush and Mincha, we like to have a study session. Professor Shlomo Toker addressed us this week, and that helped me understand this panel. Nobody understood exactly what we were talking about. So I have to thank Arnie and Avi for focusing me. I'll be speaking mainly about the situation here in Israel. Even though I think that these things hold true for North America as well. It's extremely important to expand this conversation. Besides these two main centers, we should include Europe. It is a vastly important community in Germany and South America. The whole Southern Hemisphere has to join this conversation. If we're talking about centers, I have a question about this term, center. How do we define what the center is? Who decides where the center is? Isn't the center something we can know only in hindsight? I thought about this when I took my Hebrew Union College students to Beit She'arim. The speaker has to talk directly into the microphone. Please, whoever's listening to the interpreting, tell the speaker to speak directly into the microphone. We went to Beit She'arim. As you know, Beit She'arim was an important burial center in the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud. This cemetery is full of life. Our guide, Dr. David Lavi, a conservative rabbi himself, taught us of burial customs in the time of the Mishnah and the Talmud. This is one burial method with different methods side by side in little niches on the ground, in sarcophagi. We also have to add secondary burial in coffins. What could be considered center here? What is marginals? We have inscriptions in Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek. Again, what is center and what is the margins? We can't talk about one method. There are some undecorated graves, some have figurative decoration, symbols and figures, and the menorah is a symbol that appears here as well. Again, the question is, what is center? What is the margin? In Beit She'arim, this challenges the very question, the very concept of center. What is center? In Midrash Psikta Rabbati, God spoke to you face to face from the fire at the mountain. This is in Dvarim chapter 5. Rabbi Yochanan said, the icon, the portrait, the icon of God, 1,000 faces look at it, 1,000 people look at it, people look at God, God looks at each and every one, and God says, I am your one God. This is how we should consider Judaism. Each one of us looks at the same thing. Each one of us has to understand the personal message. Rabbi Levi said, it is normal for people to listen to 10 things at once. But can a person speak 10 different things at once? God hears tefillah, prayer in the singular, not tefillot in the plural. Each and every person hears God's special voice, whereas God looks at each and every Jew individually. Rabbi Levi says God hears each person's unique prayer. God listens to every person. The pasuk says, Shtaim zo shamati, I heard twice, because God listens to everybody. God doesn't want one sole voice at the center, but a plethora and multiplicity of voices. There's a stream of voices and no center. We have a center with many, many, many different voices emanating from the center. It would be wrong to talk about the center as if we're talking about a bullseye. We're talking about a plethora of approaches. with a range of colors. The blue isn't yellow, the yellow isn't purple, the colors aren't better than one another, they are different. There isn't a hierarchy among the colors. This is how we should regard our Judaism. Colors are also very clear. We identify yellow, don't know when yellow ends and blue begins. This is a range, this is not clear cut. We can't say this and only this is the one and only thing to do. The range is valid, and this accords with other things that people were saying. This is valid for halakha. When I talk about halakha, I'm talking about observing mitzvot, the level of observance. I'm not talking about the general, more abstract meaning of halakha. Halakha is not the be-all and end-all. It is only one aspect of our identity, maybe not even the most important one. There are other identifying markers for us as Jews. The nationality aspect, our ethnic aspect, our connection to this or that place, language, customs, even genetic diseases, God forbid, foods and other customs. Why should we let one single aspect of our identity overcome everything else? Here in Israel, the politics of identity have reached a very violent, extreme manifestation, with various groups threatening to undermine the solidarity and the very weave of the fabric of Israeli society. We are emphasizing the different instead of emphasizing the common elements. We are facing the situation of extremism undermining everything. Instead of looking to the right and looking to the left, instead of trying to enjoy the multiplicity, we should enjoy the multiplicity. This is a miracle. We have so many different groups here in Israel and in the diaspora as well. I would say that the very concept of center arises only out of the extreme fringes. I would say that the center is in itself the margins. The center is a demarcation of our borders. How do we demarcate the center vis-a-vis the extremes and the margins? When we talk about center, we might also be talking about others who don't have the right to be in our center. Eva Halachman, I made a mistake. Excuse me, Eva. She says, this is a feminist issue to reject these definitions, and I agree with you on that. And I'm not sure that I always want to be in the center. I want to be the inner center, and I want to be at the margins too. I'm a Reform rabbi. I'm proud of being a Reform rabbi. I'm usually proud of the Chesed communities of Reform Judaism, of the commitment of the leaders and the rabbis. But I can't sleep at night, not because of the future of the Reform movement, but because of Judaism in general. The Masorti movement is close to my heart as well. Some of my best friends are Masorti. What keeps me awake at night is not the survival of my community, but the survival of Judaism and Israel in general. We should take a broader perspective, not just look at ourselves. We should look at the broader spectrum, the range, and the entire picture. There are differences. There are certainly differences between Reform, Conservative, here in Israel, abroad. And I can pose the question here and now. Are these differences so important? Are these differences really worth killing for? We have to fight for our home, our Jewish home, our Jewish homeland that we fought to establish here. These struggles for our Jewish home, for our Jewish homeland, these struggles don't focus on putting a light on Shabbat or stopping to wait between eating meat and milk. That isn't at the focus. I can say here that I would like to see the progressive movements uniting. I'm sure that isn't easy, though I think there is no choice, and for the long term that will happen, though we have to pay salaries and everybody wants their salary, so of course this won't happen tomorrow, but we should be cooperating for the greater aim above and beyond our limited objectives. If the entire spectrum, this beautiful spectrum from the rejuvenation of Chiloni, secular Judaism, on through modern Orthodoxy, through to the Orthodox, could we all cooperate? Could we all join forces? There's a wonderful campaign, equal love, liberal love. Look at this. This makes me very happy. We have so many things to do here in Israel, so many things to cope with: racism, religious coercion, absolute ignorance on the part of so many people who hate the idea of anything Jewish. The very idea of the reform and conservative movements uniting, is this what we have to work on now? Is this what's so important? This is what we have to devote ourselves to? I do think that we should encourage other groups in Israel that are breaking out of the sectoralism, breaking out of the center periphery. 929, Benny Lau, a modern Orthodox rabbi, and Gal Gabay, a journalist. She's secular, and they call upon anyone who wants to study the Bible with him and reclaim this wonderful cultural heritage. Alternative projects. There is, for example, a Yeshiva 929 clone. Why do I talk about 929? This project of Benny Lau's. What is it? Well, it's a project of studying Tanakh. There are 929 chapters in the Bible, in the Tanakh. Every day they study one chapter. They have a website with short articles and posts. I'm very proud that I had the opportunity to take part in this process, and I did my chapter this week, number 500. There's a yeshiva enterprise that does the same thing, but they allow only kosher people to take part in it. And there's another secular 929 enterprise. The liberal one, as I said before, is of course what I identified with. The verse says, Kulchem lifnei Hashem Elohechem. Everybody, the converts, the Jews, the poor, the rich, the woodcutters, the water drawers, everybody is included in Judaism. This is the ideal that we should aspire to in halakha and in everything else. And the verse says, I speak not only to you, but to those who are not here today. This is what God said to the Jewish people. Future generations are part and parcel of Judaism. Everybody has something to say. Everybody is welcome. And we will only do this by cooperation, not by exacerbating the differences between us. I sought a model for plurality. This doesn't mean that we don't have criticism. If you come into our tent, you'll see that we exclude racist ideas and other extremists. At the end of the day, the war is not between the streams. The war is between moderate, vital, committed Judaism that wants to study on the one hand, and Judaism that wants to exclude others and seclude itself. Thank God we have plenty of people who want to study, want liberal Judaism to flourish. We have so many people who could join us. If we talk about a center, the center is made up of liberal Orthodoxy, Masorti Judaism, both the conservative movement and the Mizrahi Oriental Judaism here in Israel, without demarcating boundaries, without exclusion. We have to celebrate the cooperation here in Israel. So many people are thronging to participate in prayer events and study events. We should be happy that more and more people want a synagogue without a mechitza. More and more people want to study, want to have a Jewish ceremony for marriage, for burials. We have to celebrate the spectrum, not by counting how many mitzvot people observe, but by finding the commonality, the common ground that will make Israel a rich, vital Jewish center that enables us to do what Ahad Ha'am envisioned. This is what we want to do by finding partners. Ultimately, maybe we will be able to identify a religious center, but we will only do this with hindsight. In order for this to be a vital, dynamic center, we have to work very hard now. We are on the eve of Pesach. Our tradition speaks of 4 sons. We like to add 4 daughters. Everyone has a place at the Seder table. When we sit around the Seder table, nobody is at the center. We are all around the center. We all join together. At Mount Sinai, everybody stood around the mountain, and God is at the center. The same holds true today. We should be a spectrum and not a tiny spot that disappears.
Thank you very much. Professor Rabbi Dalia Marks was able to challenge the center and offer the alternative, the diversity as an alternative, and I will take this opportunity as the moderator of this panel. I think that it's a very important cooperation doesn't necessarily require affiliation or identification. And I hope that in 100 years from now, we will still be able to sit together, people with different perspectives, different worldviews, and members of different movements, but we will work together for the best interests of the Jewish people. I think that the question of boundaries for me is related to an initiative being promoted by the Beit Midrash. My partners are those who recognize and acknowledge the fact that there are many different ways of being Jewish. And in this may be how I define the boundaries of the spectrum. It's a partial definition because I don't want to push anyone aside or reject anyone, but when we do identify our partners, I think it's an important part of a partnership. We have just a few minutes. We can take questions from the audience. I know that my most important job as the moderator of the session is to say that we're interested in questions, in brief questions only. Is there anyone who has a question? Yes. I'm sorry, I can't hear the question. The speaker's doesn't have a microphone. Any other questions? Would like to understand the difference between center and centrality. We talked about the center as the middle way, but maybe we are actually talking about concentrating different types of activities, different communities. We would appreciate if you could answer the questions from your seats. You can pass the microphone around. Okay, the microphone's working now. In just 30 seconds to respond to Professor Dalia Marks, to Rabbi Professor Dalia Marks, I certainly admire your expertise in the field of prayer, but I disagree with what you said. I think that there are central ideas in Judaism than there were throughout the ages. I don't think that everyone belongs to the same camp. The distinction that you're trying to make between those that have open Judaism and those that have closed Judaism, that reminds me of what the two large parties are trying to do right now. One is calling the other right, and the other is calling this other one left. While most of the residents of Israel are somewhere in the center. The same applies to Judaism. From the religious perspective, most of the Jews in Israel are also in the middle. They're not ultra-Orthodox and not necessarily secular. I think we have to focus on the center. That has always existed throughout history. It's important to develop and to reinforce the center in the state of Israel. Regarding your message, one message that we can take from one place to the next, I think that what we have to bring to the Jews of the diaspora is more Jewish education. They need more Jewish education, more open, liberal Jewish education, and what the diaspora can bring to Israel is more pluralism. And since the state of Israel has a tendency, as Professor Marx said, it's to be very black and white, to say that one thing is right and one thing is wrong. But the diaspora can bring a more diverse and more liberal approach to Judaism that exists there. Rabbi Lincoln, I agree with most of what you said. I don't think that we disagree. I certainly think that we have to strengthen through solidarity, through partnerships, not by saying we are not who they are. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a center that excludes. And unfortunately, even in this we've heard these voices in this panel as well. I certainly agree that most of the Jews in Israel are people who are interested, who are somewhere in the middle. And I think that we actually agree. I just wanted to clarify that point. Again, I want to apologize that my head isn't working in Hebrew today, so I will switch to English. I feel great. But now I have to. Now do I have to speak Hebrew? There's a booklet outside that I published that's translated into Hebrew about conservative Judaism, and now he switched to English.
I'm not going to say the way conservative, not like reform, and not like conservative. People say, well, how is conservative not like reform and not like Orthodox, et cetera, et cetera? And if I say how it's not like reform and not like Orthodox, I say, why can't you just talk about conservative Jews and what it is? So for most of this book, now you found a few instances here, but for for most of the book, we talk about conservative Judaism. Secondly, what Judaism has, American Judaism can offer Israeli Judaism, and what Israeli Judaism can offer American Judaism. What both of us are doing are offering people what I call community with a capital C and meaning with a capital M. Community will not take only one form in America. Community will not take only one form in Israel. There is a difference, however, between the sorts of community that we will form in the United States or in other parts of the diaspora, think Latin America and Mexico, and the kinds of community that are forming in Israel. So what we can teach each other in this 21st century are different ways to produce Jewish community and to develop different sorts of Jewish meaning. Jewish meaning is different if you live here and speak Hebrew every day and walk out the door and have a Jewish reality outside you, as opposed to speaking English every day or French or German and walking out the door and seeing a non-Jewish reality. That's a fundamental difference between who we are, and we can learn from these differences. I think the only other thing to say is that here we are at a profound, profound moment in Jewish history, and one of the most glorious moments in Jewish history that ever lived. And what we dare not allow ourselves to do is waste this moment. And I think that if you have Israelis who don't care about the Jewish people, and there are some, and who don't care about the possibilities latent in Judaism for them as individuals, that's a shame. It's a great shame. And if we have in America, we have a great opportunity to live Judaism fully, really for the first time in the history of the United States. It's a unique moment. And you have 60% of American Jews choosing not to belong to anything Jewish at this moment. This is very sad. So far from only emphasizing our differences, I'm very happy with Dahlia and Tova and David. Let's talk about getting more Jews assembled into this Jewish train of ours, which I think is going to great places. We can't be all things to all people. And of course, the varieties among us make us stronger, because some people will be attracted to one thing and other people will be attracted to other things. And this is good. This is very good. But I don't think we can have honest dialogue with each other, either in the United States or in Israel, or between the United States and Israel, unless we also recognize what the differences are. Pluralism is not pluralism is respecting differences between people. So let's note the differences and get past them and work together. Zakol.
Thank you to all the speakers. We will take a very short break, just 10 minutes.